Tigran Petrosian's positional and strategic play in this game is extraordinary. As his opponent throws roadblocks in his way, he keeps finding new mini plans to overcome his opponent, maneuvering his pieces, finding new strategies as a way to break through. His opponent is Albert Arutianov, who is an Armenian master and quite a strong player. They're both fairly young here, I think 16, 15 years old, but even at that age, you can see the genius beginning to come forward in Petrosian. He has white. His opponent has black. This was played in Tbilisi in 1945. Let us jump right in. Petrosian begins with d4, knight f6, knight f3, d6, c4, and g6. So Petrosian is facing the King's Indian, knight to c3, bishop to g7, and g3. He plays the fianchetto variation against the King's Indian, and White's idea here is basically to keep a fluid center and to make it much harder for Black to get his traditional kingside attacking play that he likes so much in a King's Indian defense. Castles, bishop to g2, placing that bishop on the long diagonal, knight b to d7, preparing e5, castles, and e5. At some point, Black might play e4 himself and gain space, although he has to be careful about that, but White just preempts that altogether and plays e4, and now c6 from Black. This keeps a knight out of d5, but also, more importantly, opens up the b6 and a5 squares for the queen's development. Now, the next move from White might look a little strange. Its main line, that's the move h3. And the idea is to keep a piece out of g4. If White plays a move like, say, rook to e1, now that is playable. But after pawn takes pawn, knight d4, a move like knight to g4 becomes available, which would not be available if the pawn was sitting at h3. And the idea is if the queen takes the knight, this bishop would take the knight at d4. And there are all kinds of little tactics. After h3, Black doesn't even have to move his knight, but can play queen to b6, attacking the knight at d4 twice. And after knight ce2, knight g to e5. White's okay, but the position is starting to get tricky, which is exactly what Black wanted when he played the King's Indian defense. So Petrosian just avoids that altogether by playing h3. Now here, queen to b6 is the main move, but Arutianov plays knight to h5. It seems he wants to play the traditional f5 pawn break in a King's Indian defense, which you don't want to do when the center is fluid. You only want to do that after White has played d5. But since the knight has moved, he's unveiling this bishop's pressure on the d4 square. So in order to deal with that pressure, Petrosian goes ahead and plays d5 here, and Black plays c5, locking up the center completely. Now Petrosian plays knight to e1. There are a few reasons for this move. He wants to move the knight to d3, where it will support a b5 break, b4 break, to put pressure on Black's queen side. But also he allows this knight to the queen to aim at this knight at h5. So if Black were to play f5 and the pawns were to be exchanged, the knight would hang. So that is sort of limiting Black's counterplay a little bit. Rook to e8 from Black. Now this is a strange move I cannot really explain. In this pawn structure, you really want the rook on f8 to support the f7, f5 pawn break. So rook to e8 is a little odd. Maybe he thought the center would open up and he'd be able to play e4 at some point, supported by the rook. But he ends up moving the rook back a few moves later. Knight to d3, as we mentioned. Knight to b6, aiming at the c4 pawn, but that pawn is easily defended with b3. And now this knight is a bit out of play and will require a tempo to get activated. Now f5 from Black. Rook to b1. Petrosian just continues with his plan, preparing a3 and eventually b4. The rook goes back to f8, acknowledging that loss of tempo. Now pawn takes, and here again Black cannot take with the g-pawn, which he wants to do because he wants to keep the e4 square under control, but the knight would hang. And so he can't do that here. Instead, he takes with the bishop. And the move, by the way, g4, forking the bishop and knight, does not work here because Black could just play bishop takes knight. This bishop attacks the rook, so it would have to be retaken. And then after knight to f4, Black does have a good position. The knight is strong on f4. If the bishop were to take it, then it would just open up this diagonal. So this would be good for Black. But instead, Petrosian plays the much stronger move, knight to e4. He wants to keep this e4 square under control and this pawn at e5 blockaded so that this bishop at g7 never gets activated. So he wants to keep that square e4 under solid control. Queen to d7, aiming to play bishop takes h3, so king to h2 to defend that pawn. Knight to f6, trying to build up pressure on the e4 square. And now the next move looks awkward, but it makes sense given his overall strategy. He plays the move f3. Yes, it's a pawn that's near the king, moving away, weakening some squares, but he knows he has to keep e4 under total control. h6 to advance on the king side, bishop to e3, and black has to be concerned at some point about a piece sacrifice where white gives up a piece for the d6 and c5 pawns, and these pawns can rush forward pretty fast. It doesn't always work, but black always has to be worried about it. Rook to f7, rook b1 to b2. The idea he's going to double on the f file. g5, rook b to f2, doubling. He's anticipating this file will open when the knight at e4 is captured. And if black doesn't capture the knight, well, the knight will just stand there as a tower of strength. Bishop to g6, queen to d2. Now knight takes e4, pawn takes. And now this bishop at g7 is really blocked in. It doesn't have much mobility. Rook takes rook, and now knight takes rook. So the knight is actually well placed on f2. Not only does it help defend e4, it could also maybe go into g4. But importantly, by defending the e4 pawn, it frees this bishop at g2 from having to defend the e4 pawn. And that allows him to activate it via f3 and g4. And so he can put that, what is a bad bishop, into a very strong position. Rook to f8, queen to e2, knight to c8, finally reactivating that knight that was stuck on b6. Now bishop to f3, threatening to go to g4 and maybe even to e6 if he needs to take the knight off. If that would be helpful, he could do that. It's a strong maneuver. Queen to e8, and now a3. Petrosian has not forgotten about the strategy of breaking with b4 on the queen side. Knight to e7, b4, b6 is played. King to g2, bishop to f6, and now queen to d2. He's not trying to play any sacrifices or anything over here. What he anticipates is what black is about to do, and he's aiming his queen to the c3 square where it just sort of defends everything on the queen side. And after queen to a4, queen to c3 is what he plays. That just holds everything together at a3 and b4. Queen to e8. Now Petrosian takes on c5. Obviously, black does not want to take with the d pawn and give white a protected passed pawn, so he takes with the b pawn. But this a7 pawn and d6 pawn are a little sensitive now. They're weak, and they can become targets for white. So Petrosian plays queen to a5 immediately, putting pressure on the a7 pawn. Queen to b8 defends those two weaknesses. Queen to a6 goes a little deeper into black's position, and again, puts some pressure on d6. If black plays queen to b6 here, white has a pretty good position. He can exchange queens, and then rook to b1, attacks b6, and black wouldn't be a good idea to play rook to a8 to counter the pawn at a3, because after white takes b6, he's threatening the d6 pawn, and black would be in trouble there. So black could play rook to b8, but then a4 with the threat of advancing the pawn, trying to take advantage of this pin. So that's a decent position for Petrosian. So black does not play that. He plays knight to c8, further defending these a7 and d6 pawn weaknesses. Bishop to g4 now, finally gets that bishop active, h5, and here bishop to d7. The landing spot e6 with check, or even taking the knight, were probably more natural moves, but he has an idea. He wants this bishop maybe to even settle on the c6 square. Knight to e7 was played by black. The best idea here was probably queen to b3, counterattacking this bishop at e3. That would have kept black a little bit more active. After knight to e7, Petrosian goes ahead and plays queen to b5, offering the exchange of queens and making sure black's queen does not find activity along the b file. The queens come off the board, and cb5. So we've seen the structure change a little bit here. Now Petrosian has a 2-to-1 queenside pawn majority. So he wants to use these two pawns, the A and B pawn, to advance up the board and create a passed pawn. And this pawn at c5 for black is protected and passed. But more important is this c4 square. Petrosian would love to get a knight to that square at some point where it puts unbelievable pressure on d6. Rook to b8, putting pressure on b5, a4, king to g7, king to f3, Petrosian bringing his king into the game to the queen side. Rook to b7, counterattacking that bishop. Bishop to c6, and black does not want to take that bishop with the knight, because after pawn takes, he would be in huge trouble. The c6 pawn would be way too strong. So he plays the rook back to b8. The king approaches, knight to c8. The knight maybe can come to b6, or at least control the b6 square to limit the advance of these pawns. King to d3, bishop to d8. Notice how black is trying to control the square in front of these pawns so they cannot advance. g4, locking things up on the king side. Now rook to a1, at some point preparing to support an a5 push. King to f6, bishop to d7. He's going to come back to f5 here, we'll see. And now bishop to a5. For the moment, keeping these pawns blockaded on the dark squares. But Petrosian should be able to break that blockade. Bishop to f5 now. It would be a mistake, again, to take that bishop, because after pawn takes, the e-pawn takes, the knight coming into e4 is crushing, and he's going to win the g5 pawn, and he'd easily win the game here. So that bishop cannot be taken by the other bishop. Knight takes e7, knight to e7 is played. King to c4, the king lands on that knight's c4 square. You'd rather have a knight there, but it's good to have the king too. Bishop to e8, now rook to b1. Computers prefer knight to d3 a little bit more, where the rook can go to f1 and give the black king some trouble, but rook to b1 seems good enough. Knight to g6. Now this knight is threatening to hop into the f4 square, where it will be very well placed. So Petrosian goes ahead and takes that off of the board. He has to give up the nice light squared bishop, but remember, at one point that bishop was a terrible piece behind all that wall of pawns, and so at the very least now he's trading it off for a potentially strong knight. King g6, the knight does come to d3, and here black has one chance to sort of save this endgame, and it's very unlikely. A super GM might see it, but the move is a6, and it's very, very tricky, actually, really kind of cool. White can actually take the pawn there, even though he loses the rook. Now, it would be it looks like, well, white can play a7, and there's nothing black can do to stop the pawn from queening. And that's true, but that actually would be a blunder. And the reason is this: black could take on a4, and when white queened, bishop to b5 would be checkmate. That would be an unpleasant surprise for Petrosian. But instead, what he would do, instead of playing a7 there, is play knight to e5, knight takes e5 check. By giving up that knight, he eliminates the mating pattern. And after pawn takes knight, then a7, and now there would be no mate. But it's a mess. White does get a queen, but black has a lot of nice pieces, and it's just a total mess. But that was black's really his chance to save this game. Rook to b7 was played instead. Now Petrosian plays rook to b2. Now this rook is protected, so those variations after a6 no longer work. Rook to f2, and here f7. Petrosian plays rook to f2, happy to go into a minor piece endgame. He likes his knight and bishop against black's bishop pair. Rook takes f2, bishop takes f2, king to f6. So the first thing Petrosian has to do is break this blockade on a5, limiting his queenside pawns so they can advance. That's easily done. Bishop to e1, immediately challenging that bishop. The bishop goes back to d8. He doesn't want to give up his bishop pair. That's the only thing he's got. Knight to b2. Finally, after all of these moves, the knight will end up on c4, the king will move, and the knight will end up on this beautiful square. King to e7, king to d3, moving out of the way, king to d7, and now knight to c4. The knight is a tower of strength on the c4 square. Bishop to f6, bishop to d2, bishop to d8, sort of biding time, but now a5. The pawns begin to advance on the queen side after all this time. Bishop to e7 and a6. Basically, By playing this position, Petrosian is preparing at some point a b6 breakthrough. And by preparing a b6 breakthrough, keeping pressure on this g5 pawn and on the d6 pawn with the knight, it becomes too much for black. He becomes overloaded. There's just too much pressure all over the board. And after king to c8, Petrosian has a nice tactical shot. Bishop takes g5. That does not lose a piece as it appears, because if black takes on g5, then knight to d6, check, forking the king and bishop. King to d7 to protect the bishop, and after knight takes, king takes, b6. And that would be a winner. There's nothing black can do to stop the pawn from queening. If pawn takes, then a7 and an a8, and he's going to turn that that pawn into a queen. So black just plays bishop to f8. Says, okay, I'm going to lose a couple of pawns, but better than losing the game. b6, going ahead and breaking through on the queen side. King to b8. If he takes here, then just knight to b6 check. King to b8, then bishop h4. And it's just too much. After bishop to e7, the d6 pawn is in trouble. And white just would be totally winning. So instead, Arutyunov plays king to b8, trying to slow down those pawns, prepared if white plays b7, maybe he can create a stalemate situation. He can't, but at least it's something. Bishop takes h4, a b6, knight takes b6, king to a7. And here, Petrosian plays a beautiful move. He could just play knight to c8 and bishop e7 like we saw in that previous variation, but he plays this, bishop to e7 immediately, which he can do because after bishop takes e7, as was played in the game, then knight to c8 check, forks the king and the bishop, king takes a6, and then Petrosian played knight takes e7, king b5, and king to c3. Notice this king is on a dark square, and black only has the light squared bishop. That means black can never push that king away. Petrosian can leave that king there forever, and there's nothing black can do to push it away. So he chooses that dark square there at c3. King to b6, g5, his pawns begin to march, king c7, g6, king to d7, and g7. And in this position, actually, I think it was a couple moves earlier than this, after g6, in fact, black resigned. And the reason is there's nothing he can do here. If he takes the knight, obviously, white would just queen. And if he plays bishop to f7, white goes ahead and queens and wins the bishop. And this endgame is obviously lost with the knight and h-pawn. A very demanding game, but we see how Petrosian, in the real world, that's how games usually go. You have to change plans on the fly to anticipate your opponent's stiff resistance. I hope you've enjoyed this positional game from Petrosian. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.